Greetings and salutations, friends and family. As part of the UNESCO Futures Literacy Summit, joining us on this platform is people from authors, co-authors, and their friends and family from Resetting Our Futures book series, published by John Hunt Publishing. It's a series of 10 books that are coming out, have been coming out, some are yet to come, including my own. Without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Mr. Tim Ward. The floor is yours, sir.
All right, thank you so much, Claire. And the genesis behind the idea for Resetting Our Future was that in the aftermath of this truly horrific pandemic, there's going to be an impulse. When that time comes, policymakers, activists, the private sector, people will want to jump at ideas. And the plan for the series is to have ideas out there and ready for them to jump towards, to jump to something new and different, a better future, literally a reset for the future we had anticipated. And so all of the authors in the series are experts with deep knowledge in their own fields. And I've said to the authors, think of your book as a flag you are planting on a hilltop and a path that you are starting to carve towards that flag. The people can join you on, will want to join you on, because when the time comes, people will be looking around for what's handy. And what a beautiful time this is when the Biden and Harris administration are just coming in, just taking over the reins of government. They are, in fact, going to be looking for transformational ideas so that we don't go back to past. So what I'd like to do to start with is have two of the authors each talk about their book for 2 or 3 minutes, talking about how their work intersects with issues of development and inequality. And then I'll have the two futurists on the panel, that's Rebecca and Bart, each shine a futures lens on that, talk about different aspects of futures thinking. So let's please begin with Rebecca. Rebecca Corbin is the president of the National Association for Community College Entrepreneurship.
I'm thrilled to be here this morning. My co-author, Professor Andy Gold, is also with me, so you'll be hearing from him as well. So we have high energy. I'm coming to you from Raleigh, North Carolina on the East Coast. To give you an idea of why we wrote Impact Ed, Andy, myself, Beth Kerly is our third author, is that we wanted to use the time of the pandemic where things were shut down, where people were really offered this opportunity to reflect on how they might help one another. So we started working together on the weekends and thought about how can we really convey entrepreneurship as not only a discipline that resides in the business school, but cross-disciplinary that prepares us for a future that's unknown. So together, as you can see from the cover of our book, our idea was to develop a roadmap and to lay out in a very succinct way some of the opportunities once we get into 2021 for rebuilding a more inclusive and prosperous society. So we'll be talking on this call about education, because we feel that with community colleges at every community in the US and beyond, around the world, they're not only community colleges, they're higher education learnings, universities, that is the natural place where you can leverage existing resources and really make change in the world. So we are rolling up our sleeves. We are ready for day one. We have been thankfully contacted by the Biden-Harris administration for some ideas. So we've been really creative. And I look forward to sharing with you and tackling some of the questions that we formulated earlier in the week with Tim and Claire and others. So thank you, Tim.
Paul, now let's hear from you and the perspective you bring as a vice president of Oxfam America in charge of advocacy from the point of view of activists.
I love doing these discussions with Rebecca because my book is about what might be interesting to activists. And I think a lot of the activism that's most interesting now is going on campuses across the world, where young people are asking, like, how do we get ourselves out of this mess and not just go back to where we were at before the pandemic, before inequality got so bad. And it's really great to see those new movements in racial justice, climate change, on all forms of identity, which are coming forth and embracing our differences, but in ways that create big power. If we think we're going to get a real reversal of extreme inequality in the world, with the United States playing a leadership role, it's not going to happen just from a Biden and Harris administration thinking that what they have to do is normalize our realities and restore us back to the past. What's happened over the last few decades in terms of inequality of power, inequality of money, inequality between groups has torn us apart in so many ways that unless we now name that and think about how we redistribute power from those who have too much to support those who don't have enough, we're not going to get there. So the big challenge is naming the issue, talking about it in new and fresh ways, and then getting to the question, well, how do we redistribute power? That we can tap into sharing better, particularly money, but also political power and the use of our planet's resources. So that's what it's about. It's meant to be an interesting provocation to activists because the real work starts now. The last thing I'll say, 2021, probably going to be a year when there are big power switches. The history tells us that most big transformative change happens in moments of deep disruption. We've got a climate crisis, we've got an inequality crisis, we've got a racial justice crisis, we've got political autocrats in lots of places, and the pandemic comes fifth. Thanks, Tim.
So thank you, Rebecca and Paul, for each giving us the quick synopsis of your books. What I'd like to do now is see how we can add a futures lens to the issues that you've talked about. Starting first with Bart, I'd like you to tell us about foresight, the topic of your forthcoming book, Learning from Tomorrow. If you can also perhaps offer some insights to get us going and how a foresight lens might apply to these issues.
Tim, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to participate with this great group of, I'd say, visionaries. Look, futures thinking and strategic foresight, which is the practical application of futures thinking, are basically a set of approaches and tools designed to help us identify emerging issues like inequality, lack of access to education, growing poverty. They also help us to negotiate uncertainties, and we're in a world full of them, and they seem to be becoming more serious and complex. Futures thinking and strategic foresight also help us to articulate scenarios and develop a common vision of a desired future through wide participation. They also help us to introduce innovation. Think of, in the case of strategic foresight, think of a framework that can be used in an organizational context or even an individual one to map out probable futures and identify new opportunities. And one thing that we're talking about today is seizing new opportunities. So organizations that invest in futures thinking and foresight scan the horizon for signals of change. They ascertain what are the drivers of change, and then they explore how those drivers interact to generate, say, 3-4 plausible alternative futures. These different futures or scenarios can be explored then to determine their impact and how to respond to them should they become reality. Strategic foresight enables organizations to identify opportunities for, say, in the case of a business or government, products or services, and also the potential to pivot toward offerings more relevant to the people today and those in the future. Strategic foresight also creates and embeds a culture of innovation around the identified strategies and strategic objectives.
Claire, again, our grand hostess of the whole forum, to tell us from your perspective, Claire, and I know the smart futures mindset is a complex thing, but perhaps you can give us a thumbnail sketch of how your way of thinking about the futures, of futures thinking itself, can be brought to bear on this issue.
Thank you so much. I actually came to futures thinking because I worked in development and because I saw that we're investing, certainly in terms of the lending portfolios of the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and the Millennium Development Goals that ran from 2000 to 2015, billions of dollars in a journey to what I call nowhere or just an inch step forward. And it had come to me from I did my doctoral studies way back when, that whenever you are embedding a new thing in a system, you're actually changing the system. And the first problem is that there's a design thinking problem. So in Smart Futures framework, I really focus first of all in having people understand that everything is everything in a real sense, and that when you're moving a challenge around healthcare inequality, because we're talking about inequality today, in this case SDG 10 focuses a lot on finances, but if you look at healthcare inequality or education inequality or whatever, land access inequality, you're talking about changing a system. And so the first challenge is to get people to understand that they're actually attacking a systems problem. Complex challenges require a new kind of thinker, a new kind of leader. It requires an evolutionary leader that is willing to go beyond the norms of what they were taught about team building, etc., and do their own internal work to recognize that they too are part of the system that they're leading, and their own evolutionary intelligence, their own spiritual intelligence, how they act as part of the system does impact on the system they're trying to change. Bearing in mind the agency of those people we do not control, that technology is neutral, but what we should be concerned about is the transformational use of it. And finally, is about the meaningful metric, because indeed, a lot of what is pushing development into our way of inequality, to come back to Paul's questions, inequality is happening because the metrics that we've been using have basically forced a repeat of the past. We are valuing companies for shareholder profits, and not valuing companies for stakeholder well-being. So in our context, then, this issue of systems thinking, I would say that if you don't take away anything else, we must get more people in leadership, be it local, organizational, institutional, or my new favorite word I just got from the last session, which dealt with the future of neutrality and the role that global companies in cyberspace play in aggravating the potential for war, for example. Our rule book is shared, and our decision-making capacity now, with AI being the driver, is also shared. So the Smart Futures framework is about taking all that in.
I would just like to add, I was having a conversation in the last few days with what technology and these possibilities for shared future mean with regards to the phone. I did some work a while ago with a private sector company in Myanmar, Burma, that has been working to create apps for farmers that can help them manage their crops better. There are several different applications, but at its root, you can take a picture of a dying plant, post it, and you'll get feedback not just from experts that the company hires, but from other farmers about what's gone wrong here. So I want to include the rest of you in this conversation, which is meant to be a knowledge jam, which means everybody brings what they've got to the table. Like musicians, we jam, we share our ideas, we share our perspectives. This, to me, is part of the democratization of knowledge, which Zoom and COVID has forced upon us. Because we're not meeting face-to-face anymore, we're not having one person stand on stage, talk to a room full of people. We have the possibility of hearing everybody, seeing everybody on screen as an equal. So we do want to have the rest of you see this as your conversation that you not only contribute to, but that you are a full part of. And so I want to throw out a general theme for our first round of discussion. And I'd like to start with any of you who feel that you want to add something to just jump in, which is, how do we keep a focus on inequality when there are all these other crises happening at the same time, as Paul mentioned? Economic recession, climate stress, the pandemic, how do we get a vaccine delivered, who gets it, racism, gender injustice, with all of these things going on, where and how does inequality shine through or pop through?
Almost are band-aid solutions, because they're not doing systemic work. They're doing, how can we make this work in the now? And I think the systemic work is obviously much harder and much difficult to follow through on. So a lot of institutions don't want to do it. So we're caught in this cycle of more and more band-aid solutions. And really, where is that going to leave us unless we do have almost this radical shift, not in just power, but in thinking? of how we approach these problems?
Couple of things. One is, I think as far as inequality is concerned, I think where my personal emphasis and preference is, and I think Becky probably shares this as well, is rather than talking about inequality and keeping it in the forefront of people's minds, we're very action oriented in taking steps to actually doing something about inequality, even if it's in a micro step. So I think by demonstrating that you can make a small dent in inequality within a school, within a community, within a municipality, if enough people were making those dents, I think that that could make a much bigger difference. And students like Claire are great examples of being part of that cause. Today in the United States, the millennials or younger generations now represent the majority of the population in the United States. 52% of Americans are millennials or younger. And when you speak with those individuals, one thing that you hear a lot about is the need for social change and social justice and cause-related projects. And I think that we need to leverage and harness that power right now. Social entrepreneurship is one method, one tool of leveling the playing field of inequality by working together with people that you may never think of working with before, and creating or co-creating these really cool social projects for for-profit businesses that can leverage profits for social good. And I think if you can do that, we can have a never-ending benefactor in paying customers to help fuel that impact that we are working so hard to have. The last thing I'll say is entrepreneurship is often misunderstood, and it's thought of in isolation of being this discipline of starting businesses. And that makes sense because, you know, we hear about entrepreneurs and all of that stuff, and there's many success stories, but it's actually much broader than that. And it's a way of thinking. And I think the work that we do through NACCE and all of the community colleges, which happens to work with an extremely diverse population, a non-traditional age demographic in community colleges, what we do is we develop these entrepreneurial skills and competencies in our students, and those skills and competencies prepare them to better navigate this future that is going to be riddled with resource constraints and wicked uncertainty.
I'm Deb Morrison. I work at the University of Washington, and I'll just throw my URL in the chat for folks who want to figure out who I am in the world. I'm coming to you today from the ancestral and unceded territories of the Wasanich First Nations and the region of the Salish Sea, which is home to Salish people since time immemorial. The book that we have sort of contributed to this series, I think, really comes back to what Dr. Nelson, to differentiate the Claires on the call, has named as this systems thinking effort of how do we actually hear the voices and I think of it a little bit as empower, but more that shifting power, I think that Paul is talking about and Bart are talking about in their work of how do we actually change the way in which we are organizing democratic structures. So the book that we wrote was around, it's sort of a wrapper around an effort that we've engaged in for the last year for the Action for Climate Empowerment program that is part of the UN FCCC Article 6 and the Paris Agreement, Article 12. And it comes out in the Sustainable Development Goals 4 and 13 and pretty much crosses all of them, but centers on 4 and 13 around education and climate change. But education is like only one of the 6 pieces of it. It's dealing with systemic change that is about learning to accelerate climate action. So how do we design systems that work to think about education, training, public awareness, public access to information, public participation, and then the international cooperation around all of that. And so I want to sort of harken back to something that has been said across multiple things. I think Rebecca also named it, around futures. And particularly that Afrofuturism lens. So like, what is it to dream together? What is it to think into the future together and imagine a world that is different, radically so, from what is today? And then to walk backwards from that future into how do we get there? So to be very pragmatic about how we actually plan toward that future. So the dreaming moment is, we used a process called the Talanoa Dialogues, which is from Fiji, and it has been used by the UN in other efforts. And we did it through virtual dialogue sessions in August of this year, where we actually worked with this amazing community for action for climate empowerment across the United States, tribal nations, people in the Black Lives Matter movement, all different grassroots organizers, government, academics, and we pulled them all together in different conversations and flattened the hierarchy of power. I'm trying to figure out how we leverage the differences that we bring to the world that are rich and diverse and help us innovate in ways that are critical to our shared future. And how do we lift those in ways that supports the different histories we've experienced, whether that be through chattel slavery, whether it be through colonial activities in the world. How do we shift the way in which we're currently powered and enabled to participate and enabled to have our voices heard? Youth are not asking for all the power. What youth are asking for is for us to do the things we are responsible to do, and to involve them in that work, you know, to share with them. And so we need to be careful in this moment that we don't push our responsibility onto youth, but that we own our responsibility to mentor them every moment into every aspect. And what Annie's saying about some of the entrepreneur work is so critical. Like, every time I think about business, I think about, okay, where are youth in those mentorships, in those internships, in those like deep roles of in practice, in place mentorship? You know, have you looked into tribal nations to see like who they want to foster in their own communities into that work? How, you know, and so how do we build those efforts together?
When we wrote our book, we began with the stories of entrepreneurs. These are women, immigrants, people of color, very non-traditional entrepreneurs, people with lack of access to capital. And when Andy says he played a small role, that is false. He plays a very large role. And these are all students. And these are people that have not only persisted, but have grown their opportunity for a dream of a better future by leveraging sort of everyday things that are right in front of you. And one of the things that I think about, and as I look at all of you on my screen, I think of a concept of effectuation, which we write about in our book, which is really entrepreneurial mindset distilled down so that it makes sense to middle school students and college chancellors and everyone in between and people of all stripes of life. And it's a way of really thinking about bird in hand opportunities. So if you're sitting on a reservation, you have some challenges certainly, but you do have opportunity, and looking at concepts like affordable loss. And one of the favorite things that I like that Dr. Sarah Saraswati writes about and speaks about is the crazy quilt. So when I look on my screen, I think about my life a year ago. I didn't know any of you. I didn't know the pandemic was coming. I didn't know the impact it would have on my immediate family, my children, my parents, my community. But what we've done is, I think what Deb's talking about is really leaned in together, not individually, but, you know, being authentic and sharing. And I just wanted to bring up a couple things, because I can tell you that despite all of the challenges and heartbreak that's going on, I have never been more hopeful about the future. And I really mean that sincerely.
When UNESCO basically made a decision, the staff actually that put on this event is a very small staff, core team of 4 people. And so I guess they called around and said, hey guys, we need help to pull off this global summit vision we have. Now, obviously, because of COVID, we're all living in different ways and we're much more comfortable not traveling to meetings in Paris or whatever. First, we all wanted to be in Paris, but we wouldn't be able to afford to go anyway. So I think that has brought us to a new consciousness of ourselves as a global species living in a very different mindset from when the last pandemic occurred. Last pandemic also occurred right after a world war. And the distance between World War I and World II, when you think about the years, was not that many years, like 20 years apart, almost 30 years apart. And we haven't had another major war since we realized we could self-destruct. So I think, I like to think of this pause almost as if, you know, we have been sent to our room to think again. And so we are supposed to be thinking again. And this is why for many people, including myself, Rebecca, I share with you this notion that I've been very productive in terms of the things that I have started in the last 6 months. I mean, everything I've ever thought about, I've basically almost tried to do, which is impossible, as I know. And it's the last 3 days of conversation and what has come out of it and the questions that have been raised. I'm saying, oh Lord, I have another 101 questions to follow up. But it's important that, you know, we use this opportunity. And I think the community college model that Impact Ed talks about is going to be very vital in terms of certainly for the developing countries that don't have the time and the wherewithal to say, build more, quote unquote, Harvard type universities in their countries. We don't have the energy, the time to do that in order to move. For example, in Africa and Asia, the populations are very young. They're underemployed. And you all know the good book says, well, the good book doesn't say, we who interpret the good book says that never find work for idle hands to do. If we don't get on the horn, we are not going to be able to stop the status quo from settling back into normal 2.0. We don't want normal 2.0 is just like what they call a hair breadth away. These 2 hairs on this paintbrush here away, which you can't even see, right? Away from what was in the past. And so your book, I think, because it's so practical and it's so tangible, and educational loans and educational grants are very much a part of the status quo system, was a very good offering, I think, for us to take our futures theory of Bart, right, and make it into a practical project. And really not only just do the basics, but in this case, I would say add on to what Bart and I are talking about now, equip these young entrepreneurs with foresight thinking, so they're not just planning their businesses for today, but they're already beginning to think about how do we move forward. So in fact, the offering is, can we include in the Impact Egg model modules on foresight thinking as part of the offering going forward for all community colleges that allows us to create a new capacity, futures literacy capacity in the system. And I think it's doable because you are here at this table. We're here at this table right now sharing these ideas.
I love what you just said, Claire. And I think that there's that natural opportunity. You know, perhaps we could convene some type of a summit in DC or wherever and broadcast it virtually. But what we say a lot in our work, and I do think that there's a role for those companies who've done well through the pandemic to give back. That's part of my professional background, is giving opportunities in terms of social responsibility. Now, not all companies want to do that, but there are some that do, is how can they really invest if they have record profit years? You know, that's part of, you know, the capitalist society, but let's give some of that back and let's invest in that. And I think that there's great opportunity with technology and things like that. And just one quick fun fact, one of our partners that we work with in 50 colleges around the country and historically Black colleges is investing in the lives of 4,000 middle school young men of color and young rural girls every single year. And we tell them, a lot of the faculty that work with them, you know, these kids, if they can see it, they can be it. It doesn't matter if they're foster kids, if their parents are incarcerated, if they are, you know, undocumented, come from undocumented families, if they can see a better future for themselves, and it has to be somebody that looks like them.
As Tim said, we keep this car driving along the road, to have these kind of conversations, share them one by one, and kind of become evangelists of this how we share a future moment. I mean, when I wrote my paper, how we share a future back in 2014, I had some vague idea at some point I would have a book that would talk about it. So when Tim called, it wasn't like I was like, oh God, finally, you know. Yes, I was terrified, and I've written a book before, but my friends, are you kidding? You've been talking about this for years. You better get started. So I think we're onto something here in terms of even the notion that books are sold as a group and not as each author by themselves. That in itself is a shift. So we have a real opportunity in this power switch, and even in terms of a power switch, inviting people to think of what will you be willing to give up to live more freely.
I don't even know if I remember what inconsequential thing I was going to say after listening to Paul and Claire there, but you know, actually Claire, Becky, myself, and a bunch of other people wrote a book previously about how community colleges can serve as incubators for innovation. And actually in that book, each author wrote a chapter. It wasn't even like a series of books. It was just a series of chapters cobbled together. That was a really exciting project. And I think you're onto something with, you know, Tim's concept here with this series. I think that could be a new way of, you know, kind of transmitting and communicating really important issues to different pockets of the population. I think the thing I wanted to say, I just wanted to follow up on something Becky said. I'm equally, maybe even more positive about the future than Becky. And Becky's really optimistic about it, but I'm right there with her and trying to surpass her, you know, in terms of my optimism. And one shift that I see, and I think Becky also sees taking place, is a shift in a way of thinking about business generally. Businesses have for a long time contributed to inequity, as Deb puts it, or inequality, however you want to look at it, by profiting through causing social problems. And that's been a major contributor to inequality. But we're seeing a shift where businesses now are learning to profit from solving social problems. And we see that with our students as they come through our various entrepreneurship programs. It's extraordinarily inspirational to see them work on wanting to really tackle important issues that either they themselves have experienced in their lives to that point or have observed others experiencing. So they're developing these businesses, some of which are profiled in our book, that really are centered on solving these problems through business. And I think as we accelerate that a bit more, we can really start to see some serious systems change that can be meaningful and, more importantly, sustainable. So I think that was the main thing I wanted to say.
I have also been sitting here taking everything in, and I am thinking about what's going on at my own campus and sort of the activist channels I've seen arise, not only through the pandemic, but through the 4 years I've been at this university and been involved in activism. And what's really interesting is I'm seeing a lot of the same themes come up. Paul, you're talking about the power switch. What I'm seeing with youth, it's not necessarily that they're looking to unsettle people who are already in power or make their way there, make space for themselves there. It's that they're creating new systems. I think the biggest thing that I've seen on my campus and in my city throughout the pandemic is the emergence of mutual aid networks. So it's people in their 20s and 30s creating usually these large GoFundMes and lists of people who need resources, or even a friendship. Like a mutual aid takes on so many different meanings. It's either financial aid or it's emotional aid. It's a way for a community to support each other through each other. And it's things like, if you are someone who has maybe an extra $10 a week, you put that in the mutual aid fund. And so somebody who doesn't, who can't pay for a meal, who's also in the mutual aid fund, all of a sudden they have that opportunity now. And this too, I thought it was really interesting listening to what Andy had to say about social entrepreneurship, because this kind of mutual aid thing, it's not an official business, doesn't fall into those structures, but it then gets expanded outward as well. Like, oh, well, I have a small business, or I do crafts or baked goods or whatnot. And so it's becoming either trading or promoting each other's businesses and getting, expanding these networks to other forms of financial support. That's been really interesting and fascinating to watch. And I've also found it interesting, everyone's brought up hope, because on the little questionnaire I had to fill out to get my Zoom link, it asked, what is your favorite word about the future? And I put down hope, because, I think I'm in an interesting position too with this pandemic, being 20 and turned 21 almost 2 months ago, and like being born in 99 and seeing a lot of, world tragedies and things that very drastically shaped the world we live in today, the 2008 recession, 9/11, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, these things that have shaped my childhood, and the climate crisis, where it's been really hard for so long, growing up in a world where the future is not certain at all.
There's been so much content here, and I just want to give a few reflections on a very personal level to some of this. So coming to an idea that Andy was talking about, and Becky to a certain degree, the whole idea of social enterprise. I've long been a fan of social enterprise. And in fact, at the Asia Development Bank, where until recently I had been working for many years, I gave a presentation in our main auditorium a few years ago, Can Social Enterprise Save the World? The idea was to inspire my organization to give more attention to supporting smaller scale businesses that merge the market with achieving some social and environmental good. So I am a fan at the same time, and it's an opportunity for people to act within their community. Typically social enterprises, they can of course grow, but the vast majority tend to be locally at hand. It's something you can get involved in, and there is that beauty of sustainability. It's not a struggling charity, not to disparage charities, they have their important role, but social enterprise offers the chance of having this enterprise around for years, making a positive difference, harnessing the market, and maybe on a larger scale as an inclusive business or impact investment. So just wanted to feed that in. Now on some of these other points, like the role that businesses can play through CSR, yes, true, and it's a good thing if companies are making contributions to local community and stuff. I guess over time I've become a little bit, I'm not as positive, I'm a little more cynical. Take each one as they come, but this is, at their worst, they're greenwashing or window dressing. And what we need, I believe, is really a fundamental change of companies, of corporations, where they are adjusting their whole internal behavior and operations. And one hopeful thing is young people, like one of the Claires online here, people of her generation and a few years older are looking at their potential employers. Is this a company I can be proud of? Is this a company that has values? And that can help change things. And this is one of the things, if we look at, oh, look, some companies are changing. Why are they changing? Unilever's made a lot of strides and sets an example that many can embrace. We see some hopeful actions by other companies in this year, in fact, a lot more announcements, financial institutions, banks and corporations making climate-related commitments. And that's all great. But let's make sure that they actually achieve them. And again, look at why they are doing that. It's not necessarily a sense of good in the world. They're being driven, they're being pushed, they're being encouraged. And I guess this kind of gets at something that's been burning inside me is we're talking a lot about great ideas here. What I'm missing is a sense of urgency. And so while in the short term, locally, we can be doing things, whether it's in a community-based organization, a network that Claire talked about, students helping students, or taking local action with a bigger picture in mind, we need a sense of urgency and to look at that the structural changes that have to be made. We can't put everything on the structural change movement. We can't change everything today. I'm looking at 2021. Look at the Middle East. We're talking about an Arab winter that's potentially emerging in the Latin America region that has serious inequalities, a lot of young unemployed people, lack of opportunities. There are going to be revolts, okay? And so, and in the streets of the states, part of the concerns about racial justice and this growing inequality. I come back to the sense of urgency and some of the ideas, for example, Paul's expressing in his book about the need for bigger structural change. We need to act on this.
I think this urgency issue is a really critical one. And as a longtime rusty old social entrepreneur myself, I know that action is everything in the world of entrepreneurship. And many people have ideas, and many people talk about their ideas and fall in love with their ideas. But I think the difference between what makes somebody able to execute on an idea is really where entrepreneurship lies, or effective entrepreneurship. And I appreciate that, Bart, because I think we're really trying our best through community colleges to stress a sense of urgency.
Engaging with diverse communities and thinking across existing silos is going to be critical for us. And there's this really cool idea, I think it's Karasti, who has this idea of not working. And I always think of it like when you're knitting and there's this giant like ball of wool and it's all tied up together. Like, I want to create that world of like messy knots where our systems are tied together in really complex ways to create something interesting and new. And it's building on what we have, but it's taking that systems of systems approach that Claire named at the top of the conversation here. So how do we think about that centering equity while we work to a just and sustainable future? So I think that's where I'd leave it.
Thank Tim for inviting me, and thank everyone for listening to what I have to say, because I think you'll see a lot of young activists and young people are often sort of their voices get drowned out or not necessarily heard. And so I think, again, like this is a conversation about the future. Everyone's talking about 2021. I think the future in the wake of this past year needs to be brave and it needs to be compassionate. And I think one of the best ways, or sort of an actionable thing to do, is find these sort of youth activist networks where you are and reach out and see how you can support them.
For me, what this conversation has really illuminated is the pause of the pandemic has allowed us to cease our activity. And in thinking about it in our rooms, as Paul put it, to see that activism is different than activity. Activism is moving towards something, towards a future with other people in mind, going beyond yourself, but really going towards your community, your planet, in whatever way possible. If those of us who are in places of privilege can speak out and knock down those structural constraints that several people spoke about, then we have the possibility of helping other people find their agency. Teaching them an entrepreneurial mindset teaches them to have agency in their own life. When they have agency in their own life, they can also have agency in their own community. And that's what can really potentially unleash tremendous action in the world.
Think of it as a relay, that the larger thing will need a series of 100-meter dashes, that the dash might be, let's get past December to March. Let's find levers and opportunities to sort of move the needle of thought. Let's find new allies. I think this collection of books represents such a broad perspective, from climate change to waste generation, which takes care of the whole issue of the circular economy, to education. as an engineer working in the international financial institutions, working to the end of my career on social change, I started calling myself a social engineer. So Paul, I'm with you on the social engineering. And it requires really the partnership I found in my case, because I was in many ways operating inside the box, but outside the status quo of the box, right? So I was really an enemy of the state inside the state, so as it will. And so operating at a level, I had to really learn. I'm a self-taught guerrilla warrior inside of bureaucracy. So the changes I made that resulted in the institutional change of the organization were not ones the organization necessarily wanted to do, but it was a combination of losing the levers of power that I did have on my own agency. I didn't find allies outside the institution, inside the institution, and been willing to be, in some case, be the scapegoat of all of what, when hell broke loose, to take the beating by myself. But sometimes you just can't say the right thing. I mean, you just can't, because you have to jolt the system to a wake-up call. I have to say COVIDemic, as I call it, is a wake-up call. So perhaps we're in a good time. More people are willing to sort of try something new. So let's just kind of ride this wave, if you will. You know, the posse is here, and I think we can see ourselves as a posse of 10 authors who are in the old-fashioned construct of the hero, but the new construct of a hero has to bring along the whole village, you know, bring our friends, bring our families, those even for coming with one ear or one foot in the game and one foot outside, saying, oh no, it's too dangerous, I'm going to go turn back. We have to drag them kicking and screaming over the crest of the hill. If we can't see that future clearly, I think somebody said you have to see the person. I don't know if you have to see the person that looks like you, because I had no role models of people who look like me to model my life after. So I'm very much a pioneer in that sense. People look back and say, oh, how did she do it? But I think there are people are always born in every time that are born with this kind of sense of something is wrong. And I guess if nobody is well, I guess only me who sees this, if the conviction is there, we have to move forward. So let's give them some cover so they can do what they really want to do, because I needed that when I was on the inside. So let's just find those people, partner with them, lock arms, and help Bart and myself operate with urgency in the institutions that do finance the future. Development is a state of mind. And what we are in the business of in development is we are in the business of manufacturing and financing hope. So let's do that as authors of Researching Our Future. Thank you.